646 earthquakes have hit one stretch of Nevada desert in just 3 months, and almost no one is watching. The reason that matters is simple. This swarm is sitting on the fault system that produced the 3 biggest earthquakes in the lower 48 states in the last 30 years, and not one of them was on the San Andreas. It is younger, it is inland, and it runs straight toward growing cities. By the end of this video, you will understand why America's real earthquake threat may be the fault you have never heard of, and why the desert is warning us right now. In a stretch of western Nevada desert near the town of Fallon, the ground has shaken about 646 times in the last 3 months. That is not a single earthquake. It is a swarm, a sustained sequence that has been building since the middle of spring, and it has not stopped. Most of the events have been small, but not all of them. In the middle of April, one of them hit magnitude 5.7, the largest of the sequence. About 2 weeks later, another reached magnitude 5.2. And earlier this week, on the morning of June 12th, the desert shook again, a magnitude 4 that woke people up near Fallon and was felt as far as Reno. Let me be clear about what a swarm actually is, because it is different from the earthquakes most people picture. A normal sequence is one big quake followed by smaller aftershocks that fade. A swarm has no single dominant shock. It is a sustained burst of activity, many events of similar size, often driven by stress moving through a network of faults or by fluids working through the rock. That is what is happening near Fallon. The events keep coming, week after week, and the sequence has been climbing rather than settling. For the people living nearby, it means the ground has become something they can no longer quite trust. A floor that jolts on an ordinary morning, and then again that night. The fact that it has lasted 3 months and produced multiple magnitude 5 events is exactly why this swarm deserves a closer look than the desert usually gets. Here's what you need to know right now. By itself, a magnitude 5.7 is not a catastrophe. No one has died, no city has fallen. If the size of these quakes were the whole story, it would not be worth your time. But the size is not the story. The location is. Because this swarm is sitting on top of a fault system that has already produced the 3 largest earthquakes in the lower 48 states in the last several decades, and almost no one in the country is watching it. That fault system is not the San Andreas. It is something else, something younger, something inland. And tonight we are going to show you exactly what it is, why it is so dangerous, and why the fact that nobody is looking at it is the most important part of this entire story. Ask anyone in America to name a dangerous fault, and you will hear the same 3 words: the San Andreas. It is the fault of the movies, the fault of the big one, the line everyone has been taught to fear. And that fear is not wrong. The San Andreas is enormous. It is capable of a magnitude 8, and parts of it are overdue. If you are going to be afraid of a fault, it earns a place on the list. But the San Andreas is not the only place the Earth releases its strain, and that is where the public picture goes wrong. The fault running near the Nevada swarm has a name most people have never heard. In the north, it is called the Walker Lane. In the south, where it runs through the Mojave, it is called the Eastern California Shear Zone. They are 2 names for one system, and that system is doing something the San Andreas is not. It is young, it is still forming, and it has been quietly producing the country's biggest recent earthquakes, while the entire nation looks the other way. This matters to you for a simple reason. The danger in the American West is not only where you have been told it is. A huge share of it is inland, in the deserts and basins that most people drive straight through on a fault almost no one can name. And right now, that fault is the one that is shaking. To understand why the Walker Lane is so dangerous, you have to understand what it is doing. The western edge of North America is where 2 of the planet's tectonic plates grind past each other. The Pacific plate moves northwest. The North American plate holds its ground. Between them, the Earth has to release that motion every single year, and the amount is not small. The 2 plates slide past each other at roughly 50 millimeters a year, and that motion never stops. Here is why that slow motion turns into sudden violence. The plates do not glide past each other smoothly. The faults between them lock, holding the 2 sides in place while the strain builds year after year in rock that bends like a loaded spring. When the rock finally fails, all the motion it did not release gradually comes out at once, in seconds, as an earthquake. The longer a fault stays locked and quiet, the more strain it stores, and the larger the eventual release can be. So a quarter of 50 millimeters a year, loaded into a young fault system for decades, is not a small thing. It is a substantial amount of stored energy, waiting in the crust beneath the Nevada desert, with fewer ways to release it gently than a mature fault has. For most of the last century, we assumed nearly all of that motion went into the San Andreas. It does not. The San Andreas takes up about 75% of it. The other 15 to 25% travels far inland, into the Walker Lane and the Eastern California Shear Zone. Think about what that means. A quarter of the strain between two of the largest objects on the surface of this planet is being loaded into a fault system the average person has never heard of, in a part of the country no one thinks of as earthquake territory. Scientists who study this system, including the geologists Fallon and Henry, describe it with a specific word. They call it incipient, a nascent fault, a plate boundary in the process of being born, and that is not a figure of speech. The boundary between these two plates appears to be slowly migrating inland, abandoning its old path near the coast and assembling a new one through the Nevada desert. The Walker Lane is that new boundary, caught in the act of forming, and a fault system that is still under construction does not behave like a finished one. It is messier, harder to predict, and in some ways more dangerous, because the strain is spread across a whole network of faults instead of one clean line. The Nevada swarm is showing us that construction in real time, and the clues are in the details. The first clue is migration. This activity is not staying in one spot. It has been creeping toward the southwest, and the recent uptick has pulled it back toward the Fallon area and the corridor that leads to Reno. A swarm that migrates is a swarm following stress as it moves through the crust, one patch of rock loading the next and passing the strain along. The second clue is stranger, and it is the one that should get your attention. Some of these earthquakes are breaking against the grain. The Nevada desert has a dominant pattern of faults that run roughly north to south, carved long ago by a different process that stretched this region apart. But some of the recent Fallon quakes are rupturing in directions that cut across that pattern. To a geologist, that is a signal. It is the younger Walker Lane shear imposing its own new direction of motion onto the older terrain. It is the boundary reorganizing itself, rewriting the crust right now beneath the desert. Think about what that reorganization means for forecasting. On a single mature fault, scientists can at least estimate where a rupture is likely to start and stop, because the fault is one continuous line. On a young system spread across a whole belt of desert, that confidence disappears. A rupture can begin on one fault and jump to another. It can break two crossing faults in sequence. It can travel farther than anyone expected once it starts. The honest answer to where the next large inland earthquake will strike is that we often cannot say with precision, and that uncertainty is not a comfort. It is part of the danger. A fault system you cannot fully predict is a fault system you cannot fully prepare for. And that is the situation beneath Western Nevada right now. Put those two clues together and you do not have a quiet, stable region releasing some old leftover stress. You have an active, evolving, young fault system doing exactly what a young fault system does, in a corridor that runs towards cities. And that brings us to the part of the story that should change how you think about earthquake risk in this country, because this system has done this before, and the results are already on the record. If this were all theory, you could dismiss it. It is not theory. The Walker Lane and the Eastern California Shear Zone have produced 3 great earthquakes in the last 3 decades, and not one of them was on the San Andreas. The first struck on June 28, 1992, near Landers in the Mojave Desert. It reached magnitude 7.3, the most powerful earthquake to hit the lower 48 states in 40 years. And it did something that rewrote the science. Instead of breaking one fault, the rupture jumped from fault to fault to fault, stringing 4 separate faults together into a single cascading break that ran about 85 kilometers across the desert. It came with company, too. A magnitude 6.1 quake had struck nearby in April, and about 3 hours after Landers itself, a magnitude 6.5 hit at Big Bear. This was not one earthquake. It was a whole system waking up at once. Landers is still called the temblor that changed earthquake science, because it proved that faults can trigger each other and rupture together. Stand on that desert today, and you can still read what happened. The rupture left a scar across the ground where one side of the earth slid past the other by several meters in seconds. Fences that ran straight before the quake were snapped sideways where the fault crossed them. Roads ended on one side of the break and picked up, shifted, on the other. That is what a great strike-slip earthquake actually is. Not shaking in the abstract, but the literal sideways motion of one enormous block of the planet against another. And at Landers, that motion did not stay on one fault. It tore across 4 of them, which is why this system is far more dangerous than the sum of its individual faults, because under the right conditions, those faults act as one. The second came only 7 years later. On October 16th, 1999, the magnitude 7.1 Hector Mine earthquake struck just 25 kilometers west of the Landers rupture. And here's the number that should stop you. The faults in this region are estimated to produce a magnitude 7 only once every 1,500 to 50,000 years. Yet 2 struck within 7 years and 20 kilometers of each other. When scientists studied it, they found that the stress released by Landers had loaded the very patch of crust that failed at Hector Mine. The first earthquake did not end the danger. It handed it to its neighbor. The third struck on the 4th of July weekend in 2019 near Ridgecrest, California. A magnitude 6.4 hit on July 4th. A little more than a day later, a magnitude 7.1 followed. The 2 quakes broke 2 different faults that cross each other, and the shaking was felt from Northern California all the way to central Arizona. Ridgecrest sits about 140 kilometers inland from the San Andreas, on a stretch of the Eastern California Shear Zone that takes up around 20% of the entire plate boundary's motion. 3 great earthquakes in 3 decades, all on the overlooked inland system, and the public lesson never stuck, because every one of them struck in remote desert and faded from the headlines. Line those 3 earthquakes up, and the pattern is impossible to miss. Magnitude 7.3 in 1992, magnitude 7.1 in 1999, magnitude 6.4, and then 7.1 in 2019. Every one of them on the inland system, every one far from the San Andreas, and together they rank among the largest earthquakes the lower 48 states have felt in the modern era. If that record had happened on the coast, it would be burned into the national memory. Because it happened in the desert, it barely registered. That gap between what the ground did and what the public absorbed is the whole problem, and it is the reason a swarm in Nevada can shake 646 times and still go almost unnoticed. Now connect that history back to the swarm shaking Nevada right now, because there is one more piece of the record that makes the current sequence impossible to wave off. This is not the first time a long earthquake swarm has built right beside a Nevada city on this exact system. In February of 2008, the ground beneath the western suburbs of Reno began to shake, in the neighborhoods of Mogul and Somerset, only about 10 kilometers from downtown. At first, the quakes were small, but they did not stop. Over roughly 2 months, the sequence produced more than 2,000 earthquakes, and instead of fading, the rate climbed and the magnitudes grew. On April 26, 2008, it culminated in a magnitude 5, a right lateral strike-slip earthquake, the exact kind of sideways motion the Walker Lane produces. When scientists later mapped it with satellite radar, they found the Walker Lane extending itself westward into the Reno Basin. They had caught the fault growing, using a swarm beside a city to do it. Picture what those 2 months felt like for the people of West Reno. Imagine the floor of your home moving a little, again, on an ordinary morning, and then again that night, and then several more times over the weekend, the jolts slowly growing instead of fading. Imagine not knowing whether the next one would be the small kind you had gotten used to, or the one that finally broke the windows. That is what a building swarm does to a community. It is not a single moment of terror. It is a long erosion of the sense that the ground can be trusted. And it ended not with a return to calm, but with a magnitude 5, the largest event saved for last. That is the template the Fallon swarm is now following, on the same fault system, in the same corner of the country. The parallel to today is close enough to be unsettling. A sustained swarm, the same fault system, the same part of the country. Activity migrating toward populated ground. The current Fallon swarm has already produced larger events than the 2008 sequence did, and it is unfolding in a region that has only grown since then, with more people, more buildings, and more to lose. The honest point is not that a great earthquake is coming this week. Most swarms fade without one, and this one most likely will too. The point is that the system is active. It is capable of far more than a magnitude 5.7, and it is doing its work right next to cities that were never built to expect it. This is where the story stops being about geology and starts being about us. For 100 years, America has aimed its earthquake attention at the coast. Hazard maps, building codes, emergency plans, and public awareness were all built around the San Andreas. And that made sense, because the coastal cities face real risk and hold millions of people. But that focus created a blind spot. It taught the country that earthquake danger fades as you move inland, that once you cross the mountains into the interior, you have left earthquake country behind. The geology says otherwise. The interior produced Landers, Hector Mine, and Ridgecrest. The interior is where the plate boundary is migrating, and the interior cities, places like Reno, Carson City, and the growing Nevada corridor, sit on top of it with building stock and a public mindset shaped by the assumption that the big one happens somewhere else. The structures most at risk are the older, unreinforced ones built under codes that never took a large local earthquake seriously. The people are less drilled, less prepared, less conditioned than their counterparts on the coast through no fault of their own, because the national story told them they were safe. You may have heard the claim that authorities are hiding this risk on purpose. They are not. The science of the Walker Lane has been published openly for decades. There is no cover-up. The failure is not secrecy. It is attention. The danger has been sitting in plain view the whole time, and the only thing missing has been our willingness to turn and look at it. The cost of that blind spot shows up in ordinary, practical places. It shows up in what it costs to insure a building, because insurance follows the hazard maps, and a region rated lower in risk pays less and prepares less. It shows up in whether a developer pays for the extra steel that lets a structure ride out violent shaking, because that cost is only required where the codes demand it. It shows up in whether an older building ever gets retrofitted at all. Every one of those decisions is made in the shadow of a map that underweights the interior, and every one of them quietly leaves the inland west more exposed than the ground warrants. Fixing it does not require predicting the next earthquake. It requires treating the desert as the earthquake country it has always been. So here is what to watch. The Fallon swarm will most likely wind down on its own, the way most swarms do. And if it does, that will not mean any of this was wrong. It will mean the system reminded us of itself, this time without a price. But the swarm is doing something valuable while it lasts. It is making an invisible fault system briefly visible. And what it reveals is a young plate boundary that takes up a quarter of an entire plate's motion that has produced the country's largest recent earthquakes, and that runs beneath growing cities almost no one is watching. Keep an eye on whether the activity keeps migrating toward Reno, whether the magnitudes climb the way they did in 2008, and whether agencies start treating the interior west as the serious earthquake country it has always been. None of the fixes require a scientific breakthrough. The faults are mapped, the slip rates are measured. What is required is attention, and attention is a choice we can still make. The most dangerous fault in America may not be the one you have been taught to fear. It may be the one shaking the Nevada desert right now, the one almost no one is looking at. The ground has been telling us where the danger is for 30 years. The only question left is whether we finally listen. We will be tracking this swarm as it develops.